Okay, guys, welcome back for part 2 of Airbrush Lesson 2, All the Gear, No Idea. In this section, we're going to talk about compressors. I apologise in advance that my limited setup is going to make this look really jerky and crap. This is by far the biggest thing I will be showing you on this little tripod, so please bear with me, but the point should come across pretty well. So airbrush compressors are a bit of a myth in the industry and the marketplace, and they vary just exponentially in price. You can have them for as little as sort of 20 quid, and you can have them running up to 200 or 300 quid. You will see them with all sorts of fancy extension tanks on and dual regs and all this different coding and stuff that is written about them. The reality is the simpler the compressor that you're using, the better. All the other stuff is pretty much a gimmick. People like the tanks because the tanks store compressed air, and therefore the airbrush compressor isn't on for as long and it doesn't make as much noise. I don't think these are very noisy. My kids are 4 and 5. I've never once woken them up, and I often airbrush until 1 o'clock in the morning. Even my wife doesn't mind the noise if I'm in the kitchen airbrushing. So I don't think the tanks make any difference at all to an airbrush compressor, but that's my personal opinion. And I don't think, therefore, you need to spend an awful lot of money. So this bad boy here, we can see, is what you call an AS10 airbrush compressor. A million different Chinese companies make this particular type of airbrush compressor. Just like with Forge World and ChinaCast and everything else, it's a standard design that hundreds of companies make. It's always called AS10, and that's because of the piston size inside, but that's irrelevant. You'll see these on eBay. You can get one of these for 50 quid. And if you're really lucky on eBay, you can get one of these for 30 quid or 40 quid. This is an utterly idiot-proof compressor, therefore it's perfect for us. What the compressor does is it pulls in air, it compresses it down, and it forces it out through a regulator, which you can control the pressure of, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then through into the airbrush. So we're going to talk about this particular compressor. You have the piston here, which is the oilless piston or an oilless rammer, and that is what causes the compression. Then you've got the power source, which is everything that you need to do. And this is the pump that forces the air through once it's been compressed. The only part of this that's important to you as a painter is this section here, and this is a regulator. This glass vial thing at the bottom here is a moisture trap. Moisture traps are absolutely essential when airbrushing. You cannot airbrush without a moisture trap, otherwise you will be working on a beautiful piece and you'll get a and it will just throw water and condensation across your model and or your artwork or whatever, and you will die inside. I've tried numerous different ways of getting around it, and you cannot use it without a moisture trap, and they're so cheap it doesn't matter anyway. So all airbrush compressors will have an inbuilt moisture trap. If they don't buy them, they're crap. And this will allow you to give a first line of defense before it gets to your hose and out to your airbrush. So this will catch a fair amount of gunk and a fair amount of crap. The only thing that's likely to break on your at your compressor is either the piston or the regulator. If the piston breaks, buy a new compressor. If the regulator breaks, buy a new regulator for 20 quid and bolt it or screw it back on. It's a very easy change in, change out job. Don't try and fix these, they're not worth it. So you can imagine these as sort of play and forget, throw it away when it gets messed up and get another one. If I turn this onto its side, hopefully the camera will focus rather than, let me just tap it. Okay, whatever. So this is a regulator. The red ring on the outside is pounds per square inch or PSI, and the inside black ring is bar. You can see that. Okay, and this at the top here is the regulator, which you screw anti-clockwise and clockwise to change the pressure that's being forced out of this here, which is the hose aperture. Okay, so to airbrush, you can airbrush anything between 12 and 35 psi. There is never a reason for you to use 35 psi. For most airbrushes and for most painting opportunities, you don't need the pressure to be any higher than 22 or 23 psi. 25 is a standard set. Most people will work once they get experienced at around 18. The reality is it doesn't make a great deal of difference in an early stage. Pressure becomes something very important as you get more advanced. So as a rule of thumb, set your pressure gauges to 23 psi. You do that by turning the compressor on with the hose, allowing the airbrush to compress up and to check where the needle tells you when it's fully under pressure, and then you adjust it up or down, and it will change the pressure. It's not rocket science. So it's just pull this out, and you just turn it left or right and push it down in again to be locked. So that's the simple point of the airbrush compressor. Let's just move this out of the way. That, by the way, is the airbrush compressor that I would recommend. If you are on really limited funds, you'll get something like this on eBay. Now, I bought one of these just for shits and giggles, really, to see whether it was actually worth it and what it would actually do. This is a nail art airbrush compressor, a micro travel compressor, they call them. And there's no, as you can see, there's no regulator. You cannot regulate the PSI reliably from this. There's this turny valve here which is supposed to do it, but when you've got no way of looking at it, it's pointless. Air hose connects on here, power hose connects in there. This is an airbrush stand, which again is pointless because it just rocks back and forth and will fall over and break your airbrush. I have checked these and I've worked with these extensively. The maximum PSI that this will run to is 18,500 PSI. Which is actually fine for a lot of quiet jobs. They're very quiet. You can chuck them in your bag. It will do as a stopgap, but only expect to do very basic stuff with one of these if your funds are limited initially. You don't have to go all singing and all dancing. But to be honest, this is 20 quid. The other one's 40 to 45 quid. Buy the other one. But it's good that I show you this because I've wasted money on it because I wanted to see whether they're any good or not. And the answer is not really. Okay, next up we're going to talk about hoses. This is pretty obvious. The hose is the section that connects to the airbrush and the compressor. So in the UK these are 1/8 and in the US they are 1/4. So if you're working in Europe it's basically 1/8 that you're looking for, and if you're working in North America it's 1/4. Because that's the size of the connectors on the compressors, and the airbrush bottoms will have adapters that fit that size. But I'm in the UK, so this is a 1/8 airbrush hose. Airbrush hoses start from 0.5 metre and they run out to about 5 metres. 5 metres is utterly pointless unless you're using an industrial compressor. 3 metres is perfect. You want enough length to catch moisture and to work freely without it snagging and knocking over. So I would always recommend getting a 3 metre hose, and these are not expensive. Most of these will come with a starter kit. You can buy a new 3 metre hose for like a tenner. So this side of airbrushing is not expensive. You can just have a hose and you can just crack on with an airbrush. What happens, unfortunately, with that is even though you've got an inline moisture trap, you will still get spatter. You will still get moisture buildup. Any experienced airbrush artist will have what we call an inline trap. Now, this is a fancy one. In fact, it's the most expensive one you can buy because we already know I'm a Ponce. So this is a Sparmax Bullet, and these are 20 quid. So the most expensive one of these you can buy only costs 20 quid. All of the standard ones, which work exactly as well, I don't know why I bought this one, which just looks pretty, they're about 4 quid to 6 quid. And this is the top of the hose that connects into the airbrush. And this is the last line of defense, and this will utterly stop any moisture getting into your airbrush at all. You have a regulator trap and an inline trap, you'll never get spatter, and that utterly removes the problems that we associate with it. At the top of the moisture traps, you can either screw an airbrush direct into them, or you can have all sorts of adapters. This is a quick release female connector that screws into the top of the bullet, and you'll see a little dial on this, and this is because I do a lot of feathered blending. This allows me to change the PSI of the airbrush minutely whilst I'm actually working. For a beginner, you do not need one of these. a quick release adapter will cost about £6. Okay. Last but by no means least is an airbrush stand. They come in 1,000 different forms, and they vary in price from sort of 30 quid down to as little as 4 quid. This is a mainstay one for me. It's quick and it's easy. The higher off the table or off the ground you can get them to stand, the better if you've got an inline moisture trap. Or you can have quick release couples, which is what I use, so you can have one that's low down, but we'll cover that off when we're actually painting. There's many you can get that actually bolt to a table and they sit the airbrush right out of the way. It doesn't really matter, but for a novice, the higher the better, and the more stable the better. There's nothing more frustrating than dropping your airbrush, it's sliding off the side, and bending needles and throwing paint everywhere. Compressors, as a word of warning, obviously they vibrate, so compressors walk. They have suction cups on the bottom, which are utterly pointless. You have to literally bolt them to a table or gaffer tape them to a table, and they often still just walk off the table, and it's terrifying when they hit the ground and you shatter kitchen tiles and stuff. So when you're airbrushing, always place the compressor on the floor. When you're using a 3-meter hose, obviously you've got plenty of room to avoid any damage. Stick your compressor on the floor out of the way and it'll never fall off. It'll end up just vibrating around like a lunatic. Okay, so this is the end of Airbrush Lesson 2, Part 2. The next session will be on viscosity and density of paint, and the rules of paint versus pressure. And that's a really important lesson, so please tune in for that. Thanks a lot for watching, guys.